Good evening and welcome to RestartED's virtual town hall. I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Superintendent, Long Branch Public Schools and 2019 NJASA Superintendent of the Year, Mike Salvatore.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, New Jersey. Thank you, Kevin, for the introduction. So welcome to Restart Ed, the webinars that keep you coming back for more every week. Tonight's topic, an important topic, addressing equity and racial inequality when it comes to school reopening. I don't want to just limit it to school reopening because there's a lot of talk right now around racism, anti-racism, and inequitable practices in schools. Work in the chat room tonight. We have the originators of the Restart Ed team. We've got David Adderall, the Region 2 Superintendent of the Year. You've got Scott Rocco, the immediate past president of NJASA. You also have Jay Micah, Superintendent of Schools of Matawan Aberdeen Regional School District. He's our legal liability expert that's on. We've got Chuck Sampson, the former Regional 2 Superintendent of the Year and the president of the Monmouth County Roundtable. They'll be working the chats. You've got some questions tonight, put them on in there. They'll get you some answers. I'm your host and moderator for the evening. I'm Mike Salvatore, as Kevin said. So if you're a participant tonight, you are in for a treat because we have some awesome panelists on. I'm excited. I'm a huge fan of the work that's happening. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Okay, let's see. Tonight, all the way from Jamaica, she now works in Essex County as the Regional Ed Service Commission Superintendent. Lori's worked in Patterson, New Jersey in the public school district. She's worked in Newark Public Schools and she has a keen sense and knowledge for urban education. She is constantly finding ways to innovate and build capacity in learning. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Lori Newell.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Next up on our list, Dr. Randy Sconyers. He's a DSW licensed clinical social worker. He's got more initials after his name than anybody I know. He's worked in social work and mental health. He's dealt with trauma, disaffected youth. This guy doesn't just read about it and write about it. He lives it every single day. He's the curator of Mental Hop. And I'm curious to find out more about that. So please weave that into your conversation tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Randy Sconyers.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome. Next up on the list, if you haven't purchased a book in some time, you're going to want to purchase one of this guy's books because he doesn't sleep. In fact, in quarantine, he's probably written 5 more books. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Dr. Eddie Fergus. He's an applied researcher at Temple University. He's worked at NYU. He's done books with people we've always read about, from Pedro Noguera to others. His work explores critical environment and the intersection of poverty and on systems like gifted programs and advanced placement and tracking. You name it, he's done the work. We're happy to have him here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Eddie Fergus. And last, but certainly not least, somebody I know well, is Dr. Alfred Rawls. He's an educator, he's a leader. He's the director of curriculum for 6 through 12 in the Matawan Aberdeen Regional School District. And this guy is so passionate and motivated to make sure if there's a system that doesn't work for everybody, he's gonna tear it down. I've watched him do it as a principal in my own district, and his work still lives on today. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Alfred Rawls. All right, everybody. It is time to get started with some questions for the conversations that you all have been waiting for. And I'm gonna throw this one out right to Alfred Rawls because I announced you last, so I might as well call on you first. You might remember this quote, Alfred, because you wrote about it in a blog that I pulled off the internet. You remember reading these words: "No one is born fully formed. It's through self-experience in the world that we become what we are." Tell me a little bit about that quote and how relevant it is today.
Well, thanks. I didn't know I'd be first, but if it's okay, Mike, I just wanted to first thank the Restart Ed team for the vision in terms of putting this all together. I want to give a special shout out to New Jersey students, educators, parents, boards of education who've been working through all of this reimagining schools. I think it's really important to give them a shout out. And I'm humbled to be with this panel. I mean, I'm learning more about them. Dr. Fergus, I've been studying his work for quite a while now, so I'm really excited to share a panel with him. And before I say anything, and I always like to start this way, whether it's in thought or whether it's announced. I just wanted to take a moment with the Honorable John Lewis and taking a brief pause, because, what we're going to talk about tonight and these types of topics, they couldn't be discussed now without folks, like the Honorable John Lewis. And I think it's important because, this work comes at a cost. Or a tax, as some people say. So this is the work of Good Trouble. And, I'm very happy to say that I have been about that good trouble. So now to get into answering, your question, I'm really into the work of activists and educational activists, whether it's Bell Hooks, who's all about teaching community, whether it's Pedro Noguera, who's all about teaching community and all about building community. And what I think is that sometimes in education, we fail because we're so caught up in standards, we're so caught up in skills that students need to learn, that we fail to recognize the human part of education. And when I think about education, and when I think about young people, I think about them holistically. And that part of becoming, it's a it's a two-way street, so to speak, because young people are becoming, but then it also takes a receiver of an educator to understand that becoming and to be willing to grow, with that young person rather, to open the world. So that becoming whole, that's what it means to me, and when you look at, you think about education and pedagogy, that's what when you think about it historically, that's what it was about. It was about moving people, and it was about transforming people. So, I don't know which post you dragged that off of. That's kind of probably going back for me, but hopefully I answered it to your liking.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I think you started off perfect too. Recognizing the Honorable John Lewis is a perfect segue to any conversation about equity. So thank you very much. I do want to throw it to somebody else tonight. And you've recognized this book before this title. It's called Schooling for Resilience. There's a guy tonight on who wrote this book with other people, Improving the Life Trajectory of Black and Latino Boys. It explores how choices about the structure of school shape students' development and achievement. In doing so, Eddie, you identified some strategies in this book that we can all learn from. Can you share with us this evening some of those strategies in that book?
Definitely. I also want to say thank you for the invitation, particularly David Adderhall, who we were having a conversation last week, and he said, "Hey, Eddie, what are you doing Thursday night?" I'm like, I don't know, and next thing you know, I'm here, so I want to give a shout out to David for his invite, but I appreciate sort of you all curating these types of conversations, because it's there's something that we have to recognize around defining sort of the equity work that we need to do, is that we constantly need to have opportunities to practice and exchange sort of ideas, and because none of us have all the answers, right? But reconciling that as a constellation, we can really arrive at least ascertaining and defining some key areas. But to your question, what Pedro and I were doing in that book, that particular book, which was the culmination of a study that was funded by Gates Foundation to look at, they really wanted to answer the question, is single-sex school better than co-ed schools? And in particular, we were looking at all-male schools that were targeting Black and Latinx boys. And but what Pedro and I actually wanted to do was we wanted to answer the question, what do schools do when they have a particular perspective about the population that they're serving? How do they orient their instruction, their curriculum, their intervention supports, the climate that they create for the kiddos, and in the service of what they understand the population necessarily needs. And there was a lot of sort of key things that we learned, but some of the big piece that really came out of it that we learned was that there's a way in which they were organizing their schools, and I don't in any way sort of situate that the schools were perfect at it. It was 7 schools in 4 different cities. It was a total of about 1,300 boys that we were studying over 4 years. And so one of the key things that we learned was that the way in which they were organizing the school was a relationship between sort of this idea of creating environments that had three elements of engagement that were at the forefront of what was happening. So the three elements of engagement were relational engagement, cognitive engagement, and behavioral engagement. And so as researchers, we both collected a lot of qualitative data and quantitative data in terms of really unpacking that idea. But what we arrived at is recognizing that the strongest predictor, and this came out of our statistical model of looking at the performance data of these 1,300 boys and their surveys that we did, because we developed survey scales around engagement, was that the strongest predictor of kids' performance was actually behavioral engagement. And behavioral engagement is the idea of kids knowing how to do school, right? So imagine how often we hear from kids, Mr. or Miss, just tell me what you want me to do. Just explain to me where you want me to go, right? Kids are just asking, demystify school for me. Don't make it sort of this, nebulous thing that they've got to figure out. They've got to rise to your expectation that you can't even express clearly, right? So behavioral engagement was that key element that was the strongest predictor of achievement. Then we wanted to understand, well, what's predictive of behavioral engagement, right? And what we actually learned that it wasn't cognitive engagement. It was actually relational engagement. Kids' relational sort of sense that they had with the adults was the strongest predictor or contributor to their behavioral engagement, right? So the idea of kids actually liking the adults that they're engaging as a way, as a conduit into them figuring out how to do school, right? And that's why often we talk about, kids are desiring to be around adults that they actually like and that like them back, and so for
I think we're all that way, Eddie, right? I mean, we want to hang around the crabby person with the negative attitude who puts us down. We want to be around people who lift us up.
Yeah, who wants to be around, learn from somebody who doesn't like you, right? Nobody's interested. Somebody who doesn't like you, somebody who stereotypes you, who doesn't see you have your gifts that you're bringing to the table. And so what we learn is there's a way in which we've got to organize our school climate that is intentionally giving kids the tools for knowing what is behavioral engagement for our school, and the giving adults the strategies for knowing what does it look like to do relational engagement, right? And relational engagement from the vantage point of kids, right? Not the way we think of, well, I like kids and I think kids like me. We actually need to hear from kids what is actually feeling connected to the adults in our school building. So that's at the crux of what we really try to arrive at in this book.
Well, I think that you've given us so much to think about, right? Because right now we're about to enter school into a completely new normal. So there's not a baseline of what prerequisites of what school looks like amidst COVID, right? So you literally can start building a new structure with new social systems that everybody starts fresh from. So nobody has the advantage. You really tap into what Alfred said in terms of that whole child. That's a great point. Great study. I love it.
If I can also jump in, thank you, Eddie. And I also want to say thank you to the panel for inviting me, David, Chuck, old friends. We've been, dancing around this issue for some years. So thank you for having me. And so practicality and on the ground, what Eddie is talking, we actually are putting this into practice. I've been fortunate enough to have Eddie come to my school district and meet with our teachers and really peel back some layers that were disturbing, but still needed to be done. And, one of the things that we realize is the majority of my school district are Black and brown young men who have come to my district from sending, we're receiving districts, so the districts send them to us. And one of the things that we realize is we really need to rebuild them. It's not just academics. It's really about those relationships. And it is really about making sure that we are even changing our hiring practices, that we have adults there who can relate to their experiences. You have adults who can say, yes, I've been here, but we've turned it around. We've seen and it takes time, right? But we've seen some amazing changes in kids' attitudes just to want to come to school because they have now formed a relationship with a staff member in our schools. And that is something that it's critical, because you can have the pedagogy, and that's fine, that's perfect, that's great. But what our kids need is that connection, that they can say, you know, I really want to go to school and I want to please Miss So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so. And one of the things that we've done at our commission too is we've actually started monthly mentoring programs. We have young women, but the majority of our kids are male, and we actually bring in men who can say, look, I used to be a gangbanger and I've turned it around. Look, I had kids by the time I was 18, 19, but I've turned it around. So, you know, it's also just, it's not just the academics, it's it's working on the whole child socially. Now, as we've gone into the virtual space, it has been a challenge, but it's actually been a positive, because we have support teams that are actually on the phone calling, checking in. We've been doing Zoom, and you know, just not just the academics, but saying what else is happening in your sphere that we need to be aware of. So you know, so that's what we're doing, and it's you know, it's in line with what Eddie has seen in the research as well, and actually what Alfred is saying in how do you know, form the whole child.
You know, Lori, before I jump over to Randy with a very pointed question, I want to ask you your opinion. In terms of being a regional ed service commission, professional development is probably a package that you sell sometimes. And what many school districts are struggling with right now is, how do we have these courageous conversations and not just start them where everybody feels uncomfortable and they don't know how to continue them, but how do you sustain the conversations about anti-racism and structural inequality? You know, where do we begin with that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a great question, because one of the things that, you know, we find is that people don't like the discomfort. So it's okay to do probably 2 hours, but, you know, you really have to be committed to really, you want to be able to see it through. And sometimes what we find is, we will have school districts, because we offer different types of professional development, trauma-informed care, just, you know, we have a suite of services, and school districts, there's that discomfort, and you really have to make yourself vulnerable. And sometimes that is very difficult for all of us, for whatever the topic is. And so, you know, my feeling, because I also have staff members who need additional training. Eddie uncovered some things, and, you know, we just have to keep pushing. It's not a one-time thing. We just have to keep on pushing and pushing and pushing.
That's good. Thank you very much. You mentioned a key word there. You mentioned the word trauma, and I'm about to head over to the trauma expert. So Randy, you're dealing with trauma, you've dealt with trauma, this storm inside somebody's thoughts about inequities, whether it be education in terms of a system, whether it be society. You know, how do we begin to address this and provide support to the children and staff, because they're all dealing with some form of trauma right now?
Thanks, Mike. That's a great question. And thank you to all the panel as well. And Kenneth, who invited me out also to be part of this panel and this discussion. I'm happy to be the only social worker on this panel coming from a mental health lens and wellness lens, working with young people, students for over 20 years. So a lot of stuff that Dr. Newell talked about, and Eddie and Alfred, I can relate to a level of resistance to mental health services and therapy, and how do we sort of combat that. And when you talk about trauma, you're talking about one of the most prevalent diagnoses that I see young people facing, especially with everything that we're dealing with right now. We have a COVID pandemic, and we have racial tension that has been going on for a long time. So what the pandemic did was just peel the curtain back, open it, and now we are fully exposed. Our young people have been experiencing traumatic things for a very long time, but they just haven't had the opportunity to talk about it or felt comfortable talking about it. So I could totally relate to what Eddie is talking about in terms of engagement. So when I was talking about engagement, when I talk about engagement in terms of therapy, how do I get a young person to put that guard down and allow themselves to share what they've been going through. In schools, I'm going to tell you, historically, we have not done that well in terms of mental health and those kind of issues. We just, because I think we're still struggling with a lot of times, do we even bring this into the school? Is that the right place to do it? And a lot of times we also think about the kids, there's so much shame and stigma around talking about these issues. So that was one of the reasons why I started Mental Hop. You asked me to plug it in. Here it is. Mental health education and wellness through the lens of hip hop culture. So we know hip hop, some people hate it, they can't stand it, blah, blah, blah. Bottom line is your kids are listening to it. This is the #1 genre of music globally in the world. How can we not, if you think about what Dr. Eminem, the hip hop ed, is talking about, he talks about this all the time. We have to bring hip hop into these spaces. You know why? Because there's a spilling going on in the music. There's an opportunity to share these narratives and these stories and empower our young people because they want that space to do it. So what I was able to do is push into schools with mental hop symposiums, just guided talks and discussions around trauma, around depression, around anxiety. And I love what you were saying about having people they can relate to, are passionate about, and it's about disruption. The schools that I was able to go to, we talked about trauma, these were a lot of out-of-district schools. So think about that. We send kids to another school district because we feel like they can't make it in this district. And then they go into another district, and for some reason, a lot of them do well. If we're talking about equity, why wouldn't we bring a lot of the things that those other districts are doing into the regular public school system? Why do we have to send kids out to have yoga, mindfulness classes? Why do we have to have hip hop education and wellness in an out of district school? So what we're seeing is there's an opportunity for us to serve our kids in the district, but we have to be engaging, empowering. And I love the idea of enlightenment too. So we give the opportunities to kids to discover and explore in learning. And I think that's a big part of the work that we need to do as well.
What a blend of music therapy and just connecting to children in their space where they're at.
Meet them where they are. Yep.
Yeah, meet them where they're at. Awesome. That is, if there are any therapists on, social workers, clinicians, take some advice here and take a look at that resource because that mental hop is real and it's meeting children where they're at. I want to turn the conversation over to a New York Times bestselling book right now. It's Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He specifically talks, and I remember early on in the book, he talks about his mistakes that he made as a young man in terms of these overgeneralizations, these diminishing comments that he would make in speeches about people of the same color as him. And he didn't even realize that those notions, those diminishing comments were actually racism in that one particular form. Now, he says he educated himself into anti-racism. Right? So he educated himself into anti-racism. So how do we begin to educate the world, right? Into anti-racism? And this is, actually, why don't we start with Lori? I'd love to hear your comment. How do we begin to educate the world into anti-racism?
That's a question that is, it's very difficult. I feel like individuals have to be open to having these conversations. When you have conversations with individuals and they immediately shut down, that does not afford discourse, right? And I think too, it is, sometimes it is okay to be vulnerable. I think part of what the problem is, before we can make headway, there's a lot of defensiveness that happens. And I think if we really say we want an anti-racist environment, we really have to have these conversations. We have to have open conversations where, you can say, I don't understand or I want to know more. I have friends who will say, look, I have a question. I'm not quite sure. I'm trying to work it through. I said so-and-so, but I'm not sure if that was, it's okay to have those conversations and to ask questions. I think when there is an idea though, that no, I'm fine, I have no issues, that is very hard to really to be open and to be honest about what is happening. There is, when I have done equity visits in different school districts, I do turn and say, okay, well, why am I seeing, for example, all Black boys in a special ed class? Just a curiosity. You want to be able to have those questions without people getting defensive. Because, sometimes it's not to point a finger, it is just to really ask those questions. Why are we at this point? And I think if we cannot have honest conversations about how to move forward, then that I think that's almost, we can't make progress. And I think, when the onus is on the individuals who are looking for anti-racism, it can't just be on one side of the color line. People have to be open to sit in a circle and to just flush things out. And I think that's the beginning of growth. And it's not just one conversation. I think people need to be learning their history. People need to be doing a lot of research. People need to be, I don't want to be the only Black friend. Like, we need to be able to have honest conversations.
And
because
can I jump in,
absolutely.
Lori? I agree with you in terms of, and when we talk about therapy, we talk about healing. Healing takes place in that discomfort. So a lot of times when we get people in those, and I'm at a place now where I feel like we wait for people to become open to it? And I think, I don't know if we can I don't know in the school, is it an option? Meaning we're going to have this uncomfortable conversation. We're going to prep you for it ahead of time, prepare you for it, just like I would do in the session. But you need to sit in that discomfort in order for us to heal. Now, some people are going to take heed to it. Some people are going to be for it. Some are going to be against it. But we can't afford, I don't think we can afford to wait at this point. Our young people, our kids are looking at us as the leaders, as the adults, and saying, what are you going to do about this situation? And I think that what we're seeing is this cycling, right, Lori? I think we're seeing that go on.
Randy, I love what you said, because it's a great approach to this, right? So if we have to have some uncomfortable conversation, some discomfort, some disruption to heal, to get past this, then that's what needs to happen. Because when you talk about people waiting, right? It's the old book, right? The children are waiting. That's who's waiting. They're waiting for us to pick this up. And it's too long. I want to jump over to another hot topic here, because this one is certainly hot, but it relates directly to practices and teaching. And I'm going to call on Eddie for this one. So popular book out right now is Zaretta Hammond's book on cultural responsive teaching and the brain. She presents this entire notion around the dependent learner, and I believe this is really a result of overly empathetic staff with really good intentions. Just too much guidance, too much direction. They want to steer. Eddie, is this a common practice in all your research in urban education, specifically with teachers who don't reflect the demographics of the population they're teaching?
Right. No, and I appreciate you mentioned, sort of highlighting Zaretta's book, because I think, what Zaretta tries to do is to situate that there is there's a nexus of intersection that we have to understand, right? Which is the manner in which culture lives within instruction and curriculum, right? And the manner in which we understand the science of learning, right? And for folks to, I'm a big fan of reconciling that, that there is a science and an art to teaching, right? It is not something that is you can just teach like a champion through, okay? It is actually something that you have to be methodical about, constantly being redeveloped in terms of understanding the tensions that exist between the knowledge and skills that individuals are coming in with, the knowledge and skills that you maintain, and what is it going to look like to elicit that learning process. And what I appreciate what Zaretta does is she pushes in the recognition that there's dimensions around how we are as cultural beings, that also sits as part of the learning. Her point around sort of that dependent learner is in some ways it's a bit of an artful truth of a long-standing history of the last 30 to 40 years, right? Of how we have, if you think about sort of how we have merged in education from 1968 when we had where we started to actually develop what currently lives at the federal level as the Department of Education to what we have now. We've had a short history to try to figure out what does it mean for us to try to educate everybody and educate them based on what we know and what they should know and where we are trying to do within our economy. And unfortunately, part of what's been woven in there over time is this idea of, well, let's just feed them what they need to know, or either the professions that we are going to gear them into, right? Or the types of post-secondary environments that we are seeing ourselves sort of putting kids into. And in some ways, this whole experience around kids having to learn from home if nothing else has highlighted that we went really wrong in terms of having that level of high level of dependent learning, because kids were struggling being these independent learners, right? You have tons of kids who were crying out, I don't do self-study. I don't pick up a book. I can't just watch the video and learn something and then come back and regret like that. They were pushing back. I mean, as an example, my daughter, my youngest, she's 16, she's a sophomore. The first month, she was so frustrated. She has 9 teachers. She only saw 3 of them over the 3 months that she was on court. 3 of the 9 teachers. The rest of them were just putting up videos and worksheets, and she was doing the work. She got so frustrated, she put up a petition, right, in the school district, and got over 600 kids to sign off and outline their complaints. And because I was sitting on the school board, I said, okay, I will introduce you to superintendent so you can present your findings. So she put together a presentation.
She had a great contact
around that, But at the core of it, the kids were complaining, we want to be taught, right? It's like you had all these scaffolds and overly scaffolded, and then you were forced to just let kids go, and there was no sort of safety net for them to carry forward. And unfortunately, I get that practitioners dove into doing online instruction without having any courses that they've ever taken on educational technology. And as you all know, as leaders in your own Mike and Lori, you have people who never had used their emails, who now all of a sudden had to teach online, right? And so to have them scale up, I get this frustration, but I completely worry about sort of what impact it's left for kids. That now we're left in a space where now we're going to have kids coming back in whatever format, where they're going to get yet another 6 months to a year of the same stuff, right? And again, we're feeding into the fact that we have built dependent learners, and now we're requiring them to be independent learners, and there's been no scaffolding to get them to that place.
Eddie, I've got to bring in Alfred Rawls right now, because he's a curriculum director in a district, and he knows we have to do better than we've done in the spring. Everybody had a great excuse in the spring, but that excuse is over. Parents' expectations, students' expectations are way beyond what we experienced in March. So Alfred, come on in here, and this is your space, right? So tell me, how do we reimagine what school looks like, and even to address this phenomenon in terms of dependent and independent learning?
So it's funny because I just had a conversation, was leading a presentation in a session with Monmouth County curriculum directors and assistant superintendents a few days ago. And we were talking about equity. We were talking about anti-racist versus racist, a lot of what we've been discussing tonight. And we even talked about culturally responsive teaching. And one of the teachers posed a pretty good question, and a question that we hear a lot is, do I have to do culturally responsive teaching and regular teaching? So in that, but you know, and that's when I said, well, I'm going to go to a space that I think you would be more familiar with. If we look at the instructional core, right? We say that the instructional core is made up of the teacher, the student, the content, and whatever the task is that a young person has to do, right? So many times in that instructional core, when we talk about teacher knowledge and teachers' ability, not only about their content area, which is very important, but also about them understanding the culture and the differences between young people and how young people learn, and then that complete picture that I talked about earlier. So I said, part of your job is sort of to be like, you know, an anthropologist in many ways. You have to learn and understand the cultural dynamics of the space that you're teaching in, and that is always going to be different. So I think that, and even going back a little bit more, is that right now in vogue is equity, right? So it's a great time, but it's also a very dangerous time. And when I say it's a dangerous time, is because if we don't really build that capacity in educators, okay, we are going to be doing a great disservice to young people. Over the last couple of months, I've been meeting with a lot of alumni groups from different schools around the county. And many of them are saying is that, you know what, we're going to our Board of Education. Can we talk to you about some things that we need to address with them? And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, not until I got to university did I know what Juneteenth was. Okay, not until I got to university did I know about history or the educational history in this country. So I said, wow. And I started off by saying that there's a tax to this work. That tax works both ways. It works in when we speak this truth and honesty. Sometimes we're left out of certain rooms. Sometimes we miss certain promotions. But there's also a tax which is even more dangerous to young people, because they leave high school missing such a large perspective, okay, of what America has been, what it is, and what it's becoming. And if we don't provide that, we are doing a great disservice. So I say we have to start at the top. And I'm fortunate enough right now to work in a district where our superintendent, Dr. Micah, as well as our Board of Education, has been committed to this equity work. We've been on a 3-year journey. And that meant examining student data, finding disproportionalities. We just had a book session the other night, 2 nights ago. We're not reading Antiracist, but we're reading Dr. Ibram's other book, Stand from the Beginning. Brilliant conversation, which I thought was this place to start, because I'm all with the anti-racist work, but sometimes, especially with educators, they need a contextual understanding of things. And when I had history, a science teacher said 2 nights ago, she said, you know, Dr. Rawls, 2 years ago, a teacher asked me, did I agree with climate theory? And I didn't know how to answer him because I didn't know what climate theory was. And here we are now reading Stand from the Beginning and kind of getting a sense of where these racist policies began, which then led to the racist ideas and then led to the racist acts. And once she understood that, it put a conceptual framework into, wow, this work is important, you know, and then once that happened, there became a purpose, you know, and it's not just Dr. Rawls saying, the Black man saying, you know what, we have to do more with equity. Because now, when they start seeing those disproportionalities, man, the way our special education students, the way our students of color are, you know, way up there in terms of suspensions and expulsions, but way down there in terms of achievement and in terms of being placed in gifted and honors. And once they start doing that, to me, they then begin to dismantle those concepts and those structures on their own without it being me. Because if I leave, my hopes is that that work continues, you know. So I think that when we can frame it in a way where our staff is learning, you know, because that's the biggest machine we have. When they are learning and they understand it, it makes, you know, it's not just a one-man show.
Great, great, great. I don't even know what to pick apart there. It's so awesome, everything that you're saying. Wow. Thank you for that, Alfred.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah,
You know,
sure. This is your space too, Eddie.
you know, because I really, and I'm so glad you brought up Stan from the beginning, because I think there is a, you know, your point around sort of let's be cautious in this part of the movement, because there is a, you know, how do we help people enter it in such a way that it's not a, you know, like I noticed on Amazon how to be an anti-racist sold out fast, right? Which, you know, as somebody who's a former history teacher, you know, it's like you're going to the final recipe, and you haven't done the work, right? So you need to start with Stan from the beginning to understand that, you know, because, you know, you can mistake just by reading Antiracist that, oh, it's about these individual acts that I need to do. So we treat the idea of racist or racism as something that's individual and not and forget that it's what we saw transpire regarding Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, you know, Trayvon Martin, you know, Emmett Till, is that it's the manner in which a system gave permission for continued oppressions of groups and it being given not only permission, but it being rationalized, right? It's the, well, they had a history. Well, they moved, you know, aggressively. Well, they you know, all of these set of ifs. But if we don't read a text like Stan from the beginning, you know, we could miss out on understanding how, as a society, racist ideologies have been baked into our DNA, right? That's why it's been so hard for folks grappling with getting rid of Aunt Jemima. Like, you know, folks are just having these nostalgic moments of like, but Aunt Jemima was, that's the pancakes I ate and it just made me feel good. I said, yes, you can still hold on to that, but recognize the racist ideology that gave permission for that type of characterization of Black women to be permissible for so many decades, right? And for us to have the Washington Redskins, for that to be a way in which we continue to harm indigenous populations since the moment in which Christopher Columbus landed on this place. I'm not going to say discovered, right? If we don't do that level of excavation, we're just going to treat anti-racism and anti-racist stance as just like, oh, I just need to not behave that way, and not unpack what's been the racist ideology that you have constantly carried forward without, you know, good or bad intentions, but it's just been baked into your own DNA.
I want to bring Randy into this conversation, and I'm not fully shifting gears, but I want to hold on to this topic because another hot book out there, and you've heard it before. It's White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and now everybody's talking about it, and people are mad about it, and they're glad about it. But a phrase she uses in there, she talks about trauma's impact upon trust, and how trauma can impact your trust of a group, of a person, a family, an organization. Randy, I just want to pull you into that concept there. Tell me how trauma does impact trust when we're talking about a full system or a structure.
Well, when I was thinking about how all the disruption in our criminal justice system, where people are fighting for change in that system, I always was making a point throughout this process, wait until they try to address the issues in our educational system. You're talking about criminality issues, injustices that are infused into this system. I think it's going to be even more challenging to deal with. When young students walk out of that school environment, they have to go into communities in which they experience trauma. They can't trust the powers that be, the leaders that are there. How do we expect them to come into our schools and give that same level of trust to teachers, leaders, and principals? When I walk through and I see a bunch of kids that are getting suspended, when they're in detention for this, and we have all the school to prison pipeline issues that are going on, these are traumatic issues. I used to work at Jamesburg Correctional Facility for Boys in the state of New Jersey. As you know, one of the most traumatic things you could do is put kids in this sort of issue, in this sort of environment. And then they were going into schools and we were putting them in classrooms and basements. And we're saying, trust us as the educators. We will do right by you. They were walking out of environments in which there were chronic community violence, issues going on right in their home, in their environments and in their homes, and coming to the schools looking for support. And they got the same treatment that they were getting in those environments. So we can't be surprised why students don't trust our school leaders. We haven't demonstrated anything to provide them with the level of support and comfort and compassion and empathy that we really truly care for you. And that has to mean that even in this environment, we have to reach out beyond the school. It just goes deeper than what we're talking about right now. Is awesome and powerful work and important work. But we have to step out of this. We anything that disrupts the school sort of engine, most people shut down from. You know, like, is it going to disrupt the schedule? Is it going to disrupt our learning environment? If we talk about real change, has been about disruption. If we're talking about John Lewis, the Honorable John Lewis, that good work or that tough work, trouble that we're trying to get into, this is where we need to do it, right? So how do we build trust when we're talking about trauma? Empathy from the start. Can our educators, teachers meet our kids where they are, put themselves in their shoes before you give a lecture, before you do a topic? Can you get to know our young people? Did you go outside of school and go into their environment, understand what is going on? These are all ways that this connectivity and engagement goes a long way with earning trust again for our young people.
Mike, do you mind if I hop in real quick?
Yes.
Randy said, I'm sorry, I'll step back. There was something that Randy said with that trauma, and you know, the research, Miller and I think it was Barrett, with the Urban Hassles Index, and it reminded me of this Urban Hassle Index and the traumatic experiences of young people before they even enter the school building, and then once they get into the school building, how it is compounded. And when teachers, like what I found is when we stop and pause, right, and have conversations about those things and allow time and space in school settings to have conversations about what possible traumas young people may experience, it changes a lot of the perspective, and that goes into scheduling. You know, that goes into like, how are we going to create a system where we're really listening and having the time and space to listen to these stories and understand them. And it doesn't mean lower the expectations for these young people, but it means have this understanding. You know, one of the things that I was just talking to a young man that I was his teacher, and I learned a lot from him as a student. And he was like, well, how did you know, what we needed? And that was like one of the most profound questions, you know. I said, you know how I knew? And it was a simple answer. I said, because I knew what I needed. So I knew what I needed when I was your age. So there was this empathy, you know, for me understanding, and it doesn't mean you had to have lived it, but for me taking the time to reflect on my experiences and then bring them to the table. So I think that, you know, that's the assignment that I gave the Monmouth County teachers, the principals and assistant superintendents. I said, before we meet again, here's what I want you to do. Tell me when we come back in 2 weeks from now, you're going to bring to me your most vulnerable student populations and student groups. Like, just tell me, you're going to come back and say who those folks are in your school. Because if you start building a school with that in mind first, we'll solve everything else. Everything else will become very simple. But sometimes there's a lack of awareness of who those vulnerable students are. And when Randy, when you said that, it put me, you know, in that frame of mind.
So if I can, Mike, can I please jump in?
Yes, of course.
I have to jump in. So I think, thank you so much, Alfred, and thank you so much, Randy. So, you know, in my school district at the commission, one of the things, and Eddie knows, because I've said it more than enough times, when I walk through the buildings, when I walk through the different classrooms, I actually say, and I think, is this good enough for my own natural child? So when I look in and I see these Black boys in the seats, I'm thinking about my own Black son. Is this, and I'm empathetic, and I know some of the struggles that they have. And so it's definitely more than the academics, it's the support, it is the understanding that they're going through things. You know, we've structured things that we all take for granted, that we've actually gotten grants for kids to be able to take home bags of food, not just for themselves, but for their families on the weekends, because we know the lethargy that happens when they haven't eaten. We know what happens on a weekend when they come in. You know, it is providing everything. It is providing trust that they know they can say, you know, Miss, I had a rough time, or, it's really having those relationships. And, you know, I think I've already shared in other forums my experience as a Black parent, where I have gone into where my kids go to school, my children, and have been spoken down to and completely disrespected, till I've had to say, excuse me, I am a superintendent. Excuse me, I have a PhD. You will not speak with me. And I can tell you that, you know, one of the things I'm very keen on is when I'm in the classroom with my students, I will sit down, I'll get on my knees and look at them face to face and say, what's going on? I have no issues pulling them out, because we really need to be connected to these kids. This is a part of the issue. Our kids, by the time I'm a receiving school district, think of the trauma that has happened to a child, that their own home district doesn't want them. So by the time they come to places like me, we have to provide full support. But, you know, some of the things are so, they're so easy to do. It's just having a conversation. Knowing how to even pronounce a child's name. Think about that. Some of the things, we're not gonna fix all of societal ills, but we have to be available to our children. And I think because I have two children, one who is a male, and he has said, you know what he said to me? He said, the best part of being virtual is that I'm not picked on by my teachers. And people who know that my husband and I are very involved. And so he has the protection and the support. Think about those kids who don't have that protection and support. That is our jobs as school leaders, to be that loci parenti during the day when we have them, to make sure that we are providing everything they need. We can't solve all of their issues when they go home, but for them to know that it is good to come to school, because we will be providing the supports they need to be successful, that when they leave us to go into the community, we have done right by them, that they're functional. And I think a lot of times we're so busy, you know, tracking, are we tracking, are we scaffolding, which is important. Don't get me wrong. I see Elford looking at me, you know, it's very important. However, we have to connect with the person. One of the things I say to my kids all the time when I go into the different classrooms, look at me, you value. Eye contact, you value. Say it, repeat it. And I mean, I am in their face, because a lot of times, you know, these kids are just seen as, oh, that's just another kid, that's another kid. These kids have so much value. You sit and you talk to them, these kids are amazing, but we have to make time to know who these students are. And I think that's where trust, if they see that you're interested in them, if you're interested in their story, they actually will start to bloom. And when they bloom, it's absolutely amazing.
And Mike, why do educators believe that if I break in the middle of a science class and have a discussion, a real heart-to-heart talk with my students about any of their experiences, why is that not deemed learning? Why is that? Don't we talk about critical thinking skills and discussion and exploration? It doesn't matter what subject you're teaching. If you deviate and just get with those kids and meet them where they are, when you shift back into your subject, you have kids that are now pouring, they're ready now. because you made that 5-minute, 10-minute break of connectivity that could take you through the rest of that period. So again, it's about be okay with disrupting your process if it means that our kids are going to grow from it. Have that talk.
It's a great question. And you know what it is? Some of our best educators exemplify that every day. But I think what we're seeing is such wide variability between our poorest performing teacher, poorest performing principal, superintendent, right? And our greatest. And there's this wide gap in between. But we've got to normalize the best and the expectations of the best. We only have a few minutes, and I want to have some closing remarks from you. And I'm going to ask each of you to select an audience in your head you want this message to go to, whether it be educators out there, counselors out in the world, clinicians, school leaders. But what advice do you have for them in trying to create a more equitable learning environment for their community? I'll start with Alfred.
That's tough, and I'm gonna keep it quick. But what I would say, we have a saying around our district. We want to dismantle any type of inequity, inequality, structural racism within our own sphere of influence, because sometimes this work becomes so large that we kind of struggle with, where do I start? And if you have that conversation from the people who are very important people that get our kids to school on time, bus drivers, to the lunch assistants who are in the lunchroom, if everyone is thinking about disrupting and dismantling any type of inequity, I think if you start there and you have a whole district and a critical mass who's doing that kind of work, you will then begin to see the change that everyone, I believe, on this panel has talked about.
Thank you. Lori?
You know, I can't think of one particular group. I think actually it's the adults. The kids are ready to be poured into. If we as adults can really just see and value the students who come to us, regardless of the challenges, regardless of what you know, their path has been, but just be ready and open to really set what you may know about them aside, and really be ready to start from this point moving forward. I think the results you'll see, it's amazing. And I think, you know, we can actually have equity, and our kids are vessels that are open, and, you know, they're waiting for us to pour the good stuff in. So it's up to the adults to really just say, you know, this child deserves such and such, and be ready to act on it.
Thank you. Randy?
I'm just going to speak for counselors and therapists and clinicians in school, social workers. Remember the core foundations of your profession. So often when we come out of grad school, we have these young people, these young graduates with so much energy. Then they get into the environments and the systems of education, and immediately they start to break down. I did my dissertation on self-care and burnout for this reason. Go back, remember your why. It's a cliche statement, but it's so powerful. Your why is, what can I do now to impact change? I tell my clients all the time, complex issues don't require complex solutions. A lot of times it's the simple, basic things that mean the difference. It can make and change so many things. So meet kids where they are, provide an opportunity for youth voice. When are we gonna let our students talk about what school should be like? What do they want to come back to in September? I get surveys all the time about what we should do as adults. I don't see a lot of kids interacting in those surveys. So give an opportunity for kids to speak, listen to them, and be empathetic towards them.
That's great. Thank you. And we're going to add, Eddie, final thoughts?
Sure. You know, and I'm going to gear mine towards for educators in the classroom, and so as we move into this era where now we're all of a sudden we've given ourselves permission to actually say the word anti-racist, and anti-racist being that next domain in teacher evaluation constructs that we're giving ourselves permission. Let's be clear about what that necessarily means, because it's not just the what's the work that I'm doing professionally in the context of my classroom, but also how am I also living my personal life through an anti-racist lens, right? And because it's not a matter of, part of what in social psychology they pay attention to, in order for us to really work on deconstructing the set of biases that we have, is that we actually have to have intergroup contact with the people that are different than us, that we carry biases around, right? So it's just not just a matter of like, I'm gonna read a book about it, right? You actually have to expand your sphere of personal sort of interactions where you're actually going to a different type of faith-based organization. You are going to the Wawa or the 7-Eleven in a different neighborhood than the one you usually go to, or the Starbucks or the Dunkin' Donuts, where you're actually interacting with people that are different than you, for you to sort of start dissipating those ideas that we maintain about each other, because those are the same ideas that gets transferred into the classroom, right? It is those cultured ideas that we maintain around each other. So I encourage folks to really do the hard work of intergroup contact, individuation, and being intentional around creating the counter stereotypic imaging that they're doing for kids of color.
Oh, you said so many scary words tonight, and I want to explain this to you. Dismantle, disrupt, intergroup connect, and change my routine, go to a different community. So there's some work put out there by Jennifer Neitzel. It's a book called Achieving Equity and Justice in Education Through the Work of Systems Change. She specifically talks about the role of U.S. history and the continued legacy of institutional racism. This scares the heck out of people, school leaders, educators, teachers, because it means change, and we are afraid of change. But the truth is, there's no more time for lip service, for guilt giving. We've got to be committed to the work. And where does it begin? It begins with each one of you. So I want to thank our panelists for joining us tonight. Certainly some insightful comments. We could have went on for another hour. So thank you all for joining us. Next week, we have a topic about remote learning and hybrid schedules. Please take a look at our emails going out. Have a great night, everybody, and a round of applause to our panelists. Awesome job, everybody. We'll see you next week. Thanks again, everybody.